They pressed a gun against my chest and laughed. Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. One of them looked me in the eyes and told me, old men who refuse to move usually lose everything. Then they lit the match. He paused. They were right about one thing. I lost everything that night, but they made a mistake, a bad one. They thought they knew who I was. They had no idea. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to our channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The fire started at 10 minutes past midnight. Caleb Dawson was standing at the kitchen sink when he smelled it. Not smoke exactly, more like something sweet and chemical underneath the smoke, something that didn't belong anywhere near a farmhouse in the middle of Montana. He turned off the faucet and stood very still, the way a man stands when his body knows something before his mind does. Then he heard the footsteps on the porch more than one set, and by the time he moved toward the door, it was already swinging open. 3 men came through. The first one was enormous, built like a refrigerator in a canvas jacket, and he grabbed Caleb by the collar before Caleb even had time to set his feet. The second one swept a lamp off the side table on his way in, like he was swatting a fly. The third one didn't say anything at all. He just stood near the door and watched, and somehow that one scared Caleb the most. Easy old timer. The big one had a voice like gravel in a coffee can. He pushed Caleb backward toward the door. We're going to take a little walk. Get your hands off me. Caleb planted his feet. He was 67 years old, but his body remembered things his mind had spent 30 years trying to forget. And his instinct was not to go outside. In his experience, when strangers dragged you outside, what happened next was never good. I don't know who sent you, but you need to leave my property right now. The big man laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. Victor said you might be stubborn. That name landed in Caleb's chest like a stone dropped into still water. Victor Halston. He had been waiting for something. He hadn't known what shape it would take, but he'd known something was coming. A man like Victor didn't stop at broken fences and forged paperwork and middle-of-the-night phone calls. A man like Victor eventually ran out of patience. What does Victor want? Caleb said, even though he already knew. Same thing he always wanted. You to move. The big man released his grip, but didn't step back. Tonight, we're just going to help you understand what that means. They pushed him off the porch and into the yard, and it was then that Caleb saw the others. There were more of them out there, he counted, at least 4 more shapes in the darkness moving around the side of the barn with flashlights. He heard the sound of liquid being poured, a heavy slugging sound, like gas from a jerry can, and the smell hit him again stronger now, and his stomach went hollow. Don't, he said. The word came out quiet but flat, the way a man speaks when everything else has left him. Don't do this. Get on your knees, the big man said. Caleb turned and looked at him. No. There was a brief pause. The man raised something, a collapsible baton. Caleb registered the kind used by people who wanted to cause pain without permanence. And then the first strike caught him across the left shoulder and dropped him to one knee. The second never landed because Caleb caught the third man's wrist when that one moved in, and for a moment, just a moment, there was something in all 3 of their faces that hadn't been there before. A flicker of recalibration, like they'd expected less. Then the big man hit him from behind, and Caleb went down on both knees. Stay there, the big man said, breathing slightly harder now, and watch. Caleb looked up, and the barn was already burning. I didn't scream. He had made a decision a long time ago about screaming, that it was something he reserved for things that could actually be changed by it, and what he was watching could not be changed. The flames moved too fast. They had used too much accelerant, and they had started in too many places at once, which meant this had been planned carefully, which meant these men were not improvising. They had come here to do exactly this. His legs stopped working the right way, and he sat back in the dirt and watched the barn where he'd stored 30 years of his life go up like paper. Inside that barn was the workbench where he'd taught himself to fix engines after Rachel pointed out that paying someone else to do it was money they didn't have. The hooks on the east wall where he hung her gardening tools every fall. The little shelf near the back where she kept a tin of hard candy for emergencies, which meant any time either of them had a bad day. He'd refilled that tin 12 times since she died. He didn't know why. It was just something he kept doing. One of the men pulled out his phone and took a photograph of Caleb kneeling in the dirt. For Victor, he said, like that explained everything. Like a man's life reduced to a photograph was a completely reasonable thing. The one who had been standing at the door the whole time, the quiet one, finally came forward. He was younger than the others, maybe mid-30s, with a calm face that Caleb found more disturbing than any amount of aggression. Calm people who did violent things had made choices. They weren't out of control. They were exactly where they wanted to be. Mr. Dawson, or this one said, Victor Halston is a patient man. He offered you a fair price. He gave you more time than most people get. But the highway goes through this land one way or another. That's not his decision. That's the county, that's the state, that's money and contracts that existed before you woke up this morning. What Victor can control is how this goes for you. He crouched down to Caleb's level. Right now, tomorrow morning, you can accept his offer and walk away with something. Or you can keep refusing, and the next time we come back, there won't be anything left to negotiate over. Caleb looked at him for a long time. You burned my barn. We burned a barn, the quiet one said. There's a difference. No, Caleb said. There isn't. The quiet one stood up. Something moved across his face that might have been discomfort, though it didn't stay long. Think about it tonight. Victor's office opens at 9. He looked at the other men, then back at Caleb. Don't make this any harder than it already is. Then the man pressed a gun against Caleb's chest. Not to fire it. Caleb understood that immediately the angle was wrong. The grip was casual. It was a demonstration rather than a threat, but it was close enough that he could feel the metal through his shirt and feel the pressure it represented. Old men who refuse to move usually lose everything, the man said softly. Then they were gone. They walked back to their vehicles, 2 black trucks parked on the service road east of the property, and they drove away without hurrying, because men who believe they have all the power never hurry. Caleb sat in the dirt and watched his barn finish burning. He didn't move for a long time. It wasn't shock exactly. He had been in bad situations before. He had sat in places considerably worse than his own yard on considerably worse nights. What kept him in the dirt was something else, a kind of internal reckoning that was happening slowly, piece by piece, like dominoes falling somewhere deep inside him. He was not a farmer having his barn burned. He was a man watching the life he'd built for his wife disappear in fire while men with guns and photographs took pictures of his humiliation. I thought about Rachel. He thought about the day they'd broken ground on this farm 31 years ago in the spring, and Rachel had driven a stake into the ground herself and said, "Right here." And he'd said, "Are you sure?" And she'd looked at him with that expression. She had the one that meant she had already made up her mind and was just being polite by letting him weigh in. He thought about the last conversation they'd had. She was in the hospital by then. They both knew what was happening. She'd held his hand and told him she was afraid, not of dying, she clarified, but of what he would do with himself after. You spent so much time protecting other people, she said, and now you finally have something that belongs to you, to us. Promise me you'll protect it. He had promised. He'd sat in this yard for 30 years trying to keep that promise. Now the barn was ash. The workshop, the one he'd built himself the summer after Rachel passed because he needed something to do with his hands, was completely gone. The north fence line, the one he'd replaced twice and finally reinforced with steel posts because Rachel hated seeing cattle get through, was melting in the heat. The fields that Rachel had planted in the spring before she got sick, the ones he still planted, the same way, the same seeds, the same rows, because it was the only ritual he had left, were scorched on the eastern edge, where the fire had spread before the wind shifted. He felt old in a way he hadn't felt before. Not physically old. He'd been physically old for years and had made his peace with it. He felt old in the sense of exhausted, the sense of having paid a price too many times. He finally got up off the ground. He walked inside, washed the dirt off his face, and stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at nothing. Then something shifted in him. It was quiet. There were no trumpets about it. It was not a dramatic transformation. It was more like a door that had been locked for 30 years, making a small, distinct click somewhere in his chest, and he felt it rather than heard it, and he stood very still while it happened. I went to the bedroom closet and moved the boxes on the top shelf. Behind them was a lockbox he hadn't opened in over a decade. He knew what was inside. He'd always known it was there, the same way you always know where a thing is, even when you're trying to pretend it doesn't exist. He carried the box to the kitchen table and sat down. It was old wood, dark from handling, with a simple brass latch. He opened it. Inside were 2 things: The first was a photograph. I was younger in at 40, maybe though he looked younger than 40 because he had not yet learned all the things that age efface. He was standing in front of a line of motorcycles in bright sunlight, wearing the vest he hadn't touched since that summer when he rode out of his old life and into this one. Beside him were men he recognized, one by one faces attached to names, attached to stories. Some of them long dead, some of them vanished into whatever second lives they'd built for themselves. He was grinning in the photograph, not the careful smile he gave reporters and neighbors. The real one. The one that meant he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The second was a piece of paper. Folded 4 times, soft at the creases from being handled, though not recently. On it was a phone number. I knew the number by heart, had always known it. The mind holds on to certain things whether you instruct it to or not. But he had never called it. In 30 years, he had never once called it because calling it would mean acknowledging that the part of his life it came from was still real, still accessible, still capable of reaching back across 3 decades and pulling him into its orbit. The number belonged to Marcus Walker. Marcus was 53 now, which meant he'd been 21 when Caleb last saw him. The math was easy, but the timeline felt impossible. 21, Caleb could still see him exactly as he was back then, skinny with quick eyes and a mouth that ran constantly when he was nervous, and went completely silent when he was afraid, and he had been afraid the night Caleb found him. Tucked behind a dumpster outside a bar in Billings, while 2 men discussed what they were going to do with him in the kind of low professional voices that meant they had done whatever it was before. Marcus had been in the wrong place for the wrong reasons at the wrong time. He was nobody in that world, just a kid who'd gotten pulled into something by an older cousin who hadn't bothered to explain the stakes. The 2 men outside the bar were there to send a message, and the message they planned to send required Marcus's participation in ways Marcus had not anticipated and could not escape from alone. Caleb had stepped in. It wasn't complicated. He saw what was happening and he stepped in. That was the entirety of it. He hadn't weighed the cost or calculated the advantage. He'd seen a frightened young man who needed someone to plant himself between him and something bad, and Caleb had always been very good at planting himself. What followed was unpleasant and somewhat violent, and took about 12 minutes, and at the end of it, Marcus was still standing, and the 2 men were not, and Caleb walked Marcus to his car and told him to go home and not come back to this particular bar. Marcus had grabbed his arm. "Who are you?" he said. "Nobody important. Nobody important doesn't do what you just did." Marcus stared at him. "Tell me your name." "Caleb Dawson." "Caleb Dawson," Marcus said it the way young people say things they intend to remember. "I owe you something." "You don't owe me anything. Go home." He went home. But before Caleb left the biker world, before he sold his motorcycle and drove an old pickup truck north to this farm in Silver Creek to become the man Rachel needed him to be, Marcus tracked him down one more time. He showed up at the chapter house in Missoula on a Tuesday afternoon with a folded piece of paper. "My number," Marcus said. "Whatever chapter I'm with, wherever I am, this number finds me. And I'm going to say something to you now that I mean with everything I have, so I need you to hear it." He pressed the paper into Caleb's hand. "If you ever need us, not just me, all of us, any of us, you call this number. No matter how many years pass, no matter what state we're in, no matter what's happening, you call and we come. You understand me? Marcus." "You saved my life." I don't say that dramatically. I say it because it's what happened, and I pay my debts. He closed Caleb's fingers around the paper. "Keep it." Caleb kept it. He had kept it for 32 years without using it through fencing problems, in drought seasons, in the year the back acreage flooded twice through Rachel's illness, in the grief that followed through the first time Victor Halston's lawyer sent a letter, and the second time and the third. He had kept it the way people keep insurance policies, not because you want to use it, but because knowing it exists lets you breathe a little easier. He sat at the kitchen table now and looked at the folded paper for a long time. Outside the barn was still smoldering. He could smell it through the walls. The fields Rachel planted 30 years ago were still warm with fire. He picked up his phone, bras. He dialed it. It rang once. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end was older, rougher than he remembered, more cautious, but it was recognizable underneath that. "Marcus," Caleb said. "It's Caleb Dawson." The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Caleb counted, then Caleb Dawson. The voice changed. The caution left it entirely. I wondered if you'd ever call. I said I wouldn't need to. Yeah, you did say that. Another silence, but this one was different. This one had weight to it, the weight of 32 years of a debt still unpaid, of a promise that had been sitting in a drawer waiting for its moment. Marcus, Caleb said, they burned my farm. He heard the man on the other end go very still. Tell me where you are, Marcus said. Silver Creek, Montana. Highway 12, about 6 miles east of. I know where Silver Creek is. Something in his voice had shifted again, becoming focused in a way that Caleb recognized from a long time ago. Caleb, listen to me. Are you safe right now? I'm standing in my kitchen. Are you hurt? He considered the question. His shoulder ached where the baton had caught it. His knees were sore from the gravel. His chest still felt the ghost pressure of that gun barrel. Nothing serious. Okay, a pause. Don't go anywhere. Don't make any other calls. Don't talk to the police yet. Do you understand me? Not yet. Marcus, I didn't call you to start a war. I know what you called me for. His voice was calm now, certain the way a man sounds when he has been preparing for something even when he didn't know what it was. You called me because someone thought you were alone. We're going to show them what they got wrong. The call lasted 6 more minutes. Caleb answered questions, gave names, described what had happened in the flat and accurate way that 32 years of farming life had not completely erased, the same way he used to brief his old chapter, precise and without embellishment, because decoration costs time and time costs lives. When he hung up, the kitchen was quiet. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the window looking at what was left of his barn. The fire had died down to a low burn, now orange at the edges, mostly smoke rising in thick columns against the dark sky. He thought about the tin of hard candy on the shelf that no longer existed. He thought about Rachel's gardening tools. He thought about the look on the quiet man's face when he pressed that gun to Caleb's chest. The certainty in it, the assumption. Caleb finished his water and set down the glass. He went to the closet and pulled out his old work coat, the heavy canvas one, not the flannel he usually wore in the kitchen, and he put it on slowly, the way you put on something you intend to be wearing for a while. Then he went and sat on the porch in the dark and waited for what he had set in motion to arrive. His shoulder hurt, his knees hurt, his chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with the gun barrel. But underneath all of that, something else was awake now, something old and patient and very, very quiet. Something that had been sleeping in the basement of him for 32 years, not because it was gone, but because he'd given it no reason to wake up. Tonight, someone had finally given it a reason. 6 miles to the east, Victor Halston's men were probably sitting in their trucks somewhere, congratulating each other on a job done cleanly. Caleb looked at the smoke rising from his fields. I thought about a night 32 years ago and a young man behind a dumpster and a promise given and received in a parking lot in Billings. He thought about what $120,000 in legal fees, 3 forged documents, 4 incidents of property destruction, 2 death threats made by telephone, and 1 night of arson had just purchased. And he sat there in the quiet of his ruined farm in the dark, in his heavy canvas coat, and waited. Because if Marcus Walker remembered anything at all about Caleb Dawson, about the man who once rode under the name Iron Wolf and led convoys across 5 states and stood between frightened people and whatever was coming for them, then what was coming towards Silver Creek right now was not reinforcements. It was a reckoning. Caleb sat on that porch for 3 hours before he moved. Not because he was afraid, not because he didn't know what to do next. He sat there because he was doing the only thing that made sense after watching 30 years of your life burn down. He was letting himself feel the full weight of it before he decided what to do about it. He had learned a long time ago that men who skip that part, who leap straight from the wound into the reaction, make mistakes. And Caleb Dawson had reached a point in his life where he could not afford mistakes. The smoke had thinned by 2 in the morning. The eastern fields were dark and still smelled like chemicals underneath the wood smell. And every time a breeze came through the yard, he got it full in the face and had to breathe through his teeth. His shoulder had stiffened badly. He could raise his left arm to about chest height before the pain stopped him, which told him something was either badly bruised or cracked, though he'd had enough of both in his life to know the difference was mostly academic at his age. I went inside around 3, not to sleep. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the wooden box open in front of him, and he went through what was inside it more carefully than he had the first time, not because he'd missed anything, but because the objects in it were the kind of objects that meant something different depending on what you were going through when you looked at them. There were only ever the two things, the photograph and the phone number. He had a habit when facing something difficult of laying out what he knew and what he didn't know and what he could control and what he couldn't. Rachel used to call it his inventory. She'd noticed early in their marriage that he went quiet for stretches of time that alarmed her until she understood what he was actually doing, not withdrawing, not shutting down, but cataloging, processing, deciding. What he knew, Victor Halston had sent men to his property to commit arson and assault. What he knew, Victor wanted the land and believed that removing the physical evidence of Caleb's life on it would accelerate his willingness to sell. What he knew, Victor had money lawyers, political relationships, and the confidence of a man who had never in his adult life been told no by someone who could actually make it stick. What he could control, almost none of that. What he could not control, what happened after Marcus Walker made a phone call. He had not fully thought through the implications of what he'd set in motion when he dialed that number. In the moment of doing it, he'd been operating on something more instinctual. Not quite rage, not quite grief, something in between that had moved his hands before his mind fully signed off. Now sitting in the quiet kitchen, he thought it through. Marcus had told him not to call the police. Not yet. Caleb respected that. He also understood it. The moment law enforcement got involved, things calcified. Evidence got processed through systems that moved at the speed of bureaucracy. Victor had lawyers who knew how to operate inside that speed. He had judges who owed him favors and county commissioners who remembered which side their campaign contributions came from. If Caleb called Sheriff Brooks tonight and filed a report, the investigation would begin in the morning, move through proper channels, get tangled in property law and corporate structure, and 12 other legal mechanisms Victor had spent 20 years constructing for exactly this kind of situation. The fire would be called an accident, or the evidence would suggest it, or the witnesses, if any existed, would suddenly become unavailable. Caleb knew how this went. He'd seen it before in different contexts with different names attached to different crimes, but the fundamental architecture of it never changed. Power protected power. And the only thing that interrupted that protection was a louder power arriving without warning. He did not feel good about what was coming. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He was not sitting in his kitchen at 3 a.m. feeling triumphant or vindicated. He was sitting there feeling tired and old and heartsick about the tin of hard candy on the shelf that didn't exist anymore. And the only reason he had made that phone call was because some promises don't have expiration dates no matter how much time passes. I went to his bedroom around 4 and lay down in his clothes. He didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling and listened to the farm in the way he always had, the particular silence of it, the small sounds that belonged there, and the absence of sounds that used to mean something. For 20 years, he'd fallen asleep to the sound of Rachel reading. She read everything: library books, seed catalogs, the backs of cereal boxes, if nothing else was available. She'd read out loud without realizing she was doing it, just a low murmur that he had eventually come to need the way some people need a fan running. The silence after she died had been the first concrete thing that convinced him she was gone. Not the hospital, not the funeral, not the paperwork. The silence. I was thinking about her when the phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. He answered it before the second ring. "It's me," Marcus said. His voice was different from the previous night. The focused quality was still there, but there was something underneath it, something charged like a current running through wire. "I need you to understand something before we talk further. What happened last night is not just about you." Caleb sat up. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Victor Halston has been doing this for 8 years. Your farm is number 11. A pause. "I've been making calls since midnight, Caleb. I've been talking to people. Your situation is not unique. It's a pattern." Something cold moved through Caleb's chest. 8 years. 8 years. 10 farms before yours, 4 of them owned by elderly people who had no family nearby. 3 of those 10 ended up in hospitals. One of them, a 71-year-old woman named Dora Sattler, about 40 miles north of you, had her well poisoned. They called it contamination from an old storage tank. The county environmental people wrote a report. The report was filed. Nothing happened. Another pause. Victor's lawyer sent her a settlement offer the week the report was published. Caleb was quiet for a moment. She'd take it. She didn't have a choice. She had nobody. He sat with that, a 71-year-old woman whose well had been poisoned, who had sat in her home the way Caleb had sat on his porch, who had gone through that same slow inventory of what she knew and what she could control, and had arrived at the conclusion that she was alone and could not fight it. He felt something he hadn't expected, not anger exactly, though anger was part of it, a kind of shame, not personal shame, the broader kind. The kind that comes from living in a world that allows certain things to happen to certain kinds of people because nobody is watching closely enough. Marcus, he said, how many people know about this? They do now. His voice had an edge in it. I've been up all night. We've been in contact with 4 of the other landowners. 3 of them are willing to talk. One of them, a man named Gerald Pruitt, 68 years old, lost his livestock operation 2 years ago. He's been keeping records. Written records, Caleb. Dates, names, license plates. He was waiting for someone else to stand up first. Caleb pressed his fingers against his forehead. He was waiting for someone like me. I was waiting for someone who couldn't be ignored. That's different. A brief silence. You know what your problem is? Caleb, you left. You disappeared. You became a farmer. And you stayed in your lane. And you kept your head down. And nobody outside of Silver Creek knew your name anymore. And that was exactly what you wanted. I understand that. His voice softened slightly. But Victor Halston picked the wrong man to push. He didn't check your history. He didn't do his homework. I saw an old farmer, and he made an assumption. I'm not going to wear the colors again, Marcus. I know that. I mean it. I know you mean it. A pause. I'm not asking you to, but I need you to let what's already in motion keep moving. Can you do that? Caleb looked out the window at his yard. When are you coming? We're already coming, Marcus said. Some of us left last night. Some of us left this morning. 6 hours, maybe 7. How many enough? Caleb opened his mouth and then closed it. He understood that Marcus was not going to give him a number because Marcus either didn't have an exact number yet, or he did have one and knew that Caleb would try to minimize it, and Marcus had apparently made the decision not to let him do that. In 32 years, apparently the man had gotten smart. One more thing, Marcus said. Have you talked to anyone in Silver Creek about what happened? No, you told me not to. Good. Don't. Not yet. And don't talk to the media. Don't talk to Victor's people. Don't sign anything. Don't accept any calls from numbers you don't recognize. A beat. And Caleb, yeah. Lock your door. Caleb looked at the front door of his house, which he had not locked in approximately 15 years. All right, he said. They hung up. He made himself breakfast. Not because he was hungry, but because the act of making food was something concrete to do with his hands, and his hands needed something to do. He made eggs and toast and ate them standing at the counter because sitting at the kitchen table involved looking at the wooden box with its photograph and its phone number, and he had looked at those long enough. He was washing his plate when he heard a car slow down on the road outside. He moved to the window and looked out. It was a silver sedan, late model tinted windows. It slowed to nearly a stop at the end of his driveway, then continued past. He memorized the partial plate number. He hadn't done that in 30 years either, but the habit came back instantly, like reaching for something that had always been on the same shelf. A few minutes later, it came back from the other direction. Slowed again, didn't stop, watching him. Victor checking his investment, probably. Making sure the old farmer was sufficiently reduced. Making sure last night had done what it was supposed to do. Caleb stayed at the window until the car moved on and didn't come back. His neighbor, a man named Pete Calloway, who ran a cattle operation about a mile north, showed up at 9:30 with his truck and his oldest son. Pete was 63, built like a man who had been working outdoors for 40 years, which he had, and he stood in Caleb's yard looking at the barn with the expression of someone who had seen this kind of thing done to farmland before and still couldn't make himself accept it. I smelled the smoke last night, Pete said. Meant to come by sooner, but I didn't want to intrude. He looked at Caleb's face. You get hurt. Shoulder, I'm fine. You're not fine. Pete's jaw worked. What happened, Caleb? Caleb had spent the morning deciding how much to say and to whom, and Pete was one of the 2 people in Silver Creek he trusted without qualification. He told him, not everything he left out the phone call and what was coming, but the fire the men, the gun pressed to his chest, the photograph one of them had taken. Pete's son, Danny, who was 29 and not given to excessive expression, made a sound like air going out of a tire very fast and turned away for a moment. "This is Halston," Pete said, not a question. "Yes. I've been hearing things about that man for 3 years." Pete's voice had gone very controlled, the way voices go when someone is managing a strong emotion through deliberate effort. "Dale Whitmore over in Garrison told me Halston's people came to see him twice last year." Dale said no twice. Then his combine broke down in a way that wasn't mechanical failure, and the parts supplier he'd been using for 20 years suddenly couldn't get him a replacement for 6 weeks. He looked at the burned barn. "I didn't put it together until now." "It's a pattern," Caleb said. "Longer than you know." Pete studied him for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I'm working on it." "Caleb," Pete stepped closer and dropped his voice. "You need to be careful. This man has the county commissioner in his pocket. I don't know about the sheriff. Dan Brooks is a decent man, but above him, I wouldn't count on it." "I know. Do you want to stay with us?" Linda would. "No." He said it gently, but without room for negotiation. "I'm staying on my property." Pete held his eyes for a moment, then nodded. He understood that kind of decision. He'd probably have made the same one. "Danny and I will come back this afternoon and start clearing debris. You're not going to do that alone." He started to turn toward his truck, then stopped. "Caleb, whatever you're working on, if there's something I can do, you tell me. My name, my word, whatever you need." He said it quietly with the weight of a man who understood that offers of support were only meaningful if they were unconditional. "You've been a good neighbor for 30 years. That means something." Caleb looked at him. "I know it does, Pete. I know." After Pete's truck left the drive, Caleb went back inside and sat for a while. He thought about what Marcus had said. Victor Halston had done this for 8 years, 10 farms before this one. A 71-year-old woman whose well was poisoned. A man named Gerald Pruitt who had been keeping written records for 2 years, waiting in his quiet, determined way for someone to stand up first. The thing about standing up first is that it doesn't feel like courage when you're doing it. It feels like exhaustion. It feels like you have run out of the energy required to stay down. At 11 in the morning, Caleb's phone rang again. He didn't recognize the number, but it was a Montana area code, and he answered it. "Mr. Dawson," a woman's voice, careful, a little breathless. "My name is Leanne Pruitt. My father is Gerald Pruitt. He said you might be hearing from him, and I wanted to call first because he doesn't like to ask for things himself, and I wanted to make sure you understood what this means to him." Caleb sat very still. "I'm listening." "My father lost his livestock operation 2 years ago because of Victor Halston. He had 18 head of cattle and a small beef business he'd been running since before I was born. He loved that operation." Her voice caught for just a moment. "He's been keeping records since the day they started pressuring him. He wrote down everything, every visit, every threat. The names they used, sometimes first names only, but names the license plates of the trucks they came in, the dates and times of every phone call where someone said something that made him feel afraid." A pause. "He printed all of it and put it in a binder. Then he printed a copy, then another one. He made 3 copies and kept them in different places because he was afraid they'd come and take them." Caleb felt something move through him. The image of that an old man making copies of his fear 3 times over and hiding them in different places hit him somewhere specific, somewhere he hadn't expected. "I wants to talk to you," Leanne said. "In person. He doesn't like phones. He's 70 years old, and he said that if someone is finally pushing back on this, he needs to look that person in the eye before he decides to trust them." A brief pause. "He said he'd drive to you. He said he'd do it today." Caleb looked at his burned yard. "Tell him to come," he said. "I'll be here." Gerald Pruitt arrived at 1 in the afternoon in a truck that looked about as old as Caleb's, driven by a man who looked about the same age as Caleb, with about the same weathered quality that decades of Montana farming produces in a face. He got out slowly and stood looking at the ruins of the barn for a long time before he walked over. He had a canvas binder under his arm. He looked at Caleb's face and then at his shoulder. "You got hit," he said. "Yeah." Gerald nodded, like that confirmed something he'd expected. "Did they use a baton or their hands?" "Baton. That's how they did me too." He said it matter-of-factly, not for sympathy, just placing the data point. "First visit, they were polite. Second visit, they broke my gate. Third visit," he paused. "Third visit, they came in the middle of the night when I wasn't home and put something in my water tank. Something that killed 4 of my cattle before I figured out what happened." His voice was steady, but something in it cost him something. 4 animals I'd raised from calves. They stood there together for a moment in the quiet of the ruined yard. "Come inside," Caleb said. They sat at the kitchen table and Gerald put the binder down between them and opened it. It was meticulous. Gerald Pruitt was not an educated man in the formal sense. Caleb gathered this quickly from the way he spoke and the way he presented his information. But he had a naturally orderly mind, the kind that farmers often develop as a survival mechanism. And what he had documented over 2 years was more thorough than anything a professional investigator might have assembled. Names, dates, descriptions of vehicles, partial license plates, phone records he'd kept his phone bills and marked the calls, descriptions of every physical incident, a map he'd drawn himself of Victor's property holdings in the county and the ones he was allegedly acquiring with dates and prices he'd obtained from public records. "I got this from the county assessor's office," Gerald said, pointing to one of the pages. "It's public information. You can just ask for it." A pause. "Most people don't know that." Caleb turned through the pages slowly. "Gerald, why didn't you take this to the sheriff?" Gerald looked at him. Not with resentment, with the patience of a man who has thought through the same question many times. "I took it to the deputy 2 years ago. He took a copy and told me they'd look into it." A pause. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Victor Halston's lawyer. They were following up on their offer to purchase my property. The lawyer mentioned casually, like it meant nothing, that he understood I'd recently been in contact with the sheriff's department about some concerns. He let that sit. I never went back. Caleb closed the binder carefully. "There's more," Gerald said. "My daughter Leanne, she's a paralegal. She works up in Great Falls. She's been helping me understand what's in the county land records. The highway expansion that Halston is tied to, it's real. But the route isn't fixed. There are 2 possible routes the state DO was considering, and one of them doesn't go through any of the farmland Halston's been buying." He leaned forward. "The route changed. 18 months ago, the preferred route changed on the DOT's internal documentation. We got a copy through a records request." He tapped the binder. "It's in there. The change happened 6 weeks after Victor Halston attended a fundraiser for the State Transportation Committee chairman." The kitchen was very quiet. "6 weeks," Caleb said. 6 weeks. Caleb looked at the binder. He looked at Gerald Pruitt's face, the careful, worn, deeply patient face of a man who had been sitting on this information for a long time, waiting for the moment when giving it to the right person would mean something. "Why me?" Caleb said. Gerald thought about it. "Because you didn't leave," he said. "Everyone else he hit, they left. They took the settlement, or they gave up their land, or they just disappeared. I was watching to see what you'd do." He picked up his coffee cup and held it in both hands. "When I heard they'd burned your barn, I thought, that's it. That's the last one. That old farmer's going to take the money, and they're going to win." He looked at Caleb directly. "Then my daughter heard through someone in town that you were still here, still on the property. Next morning." A pause. "I told her to call you." Caleb understood what that meant. He understood the particular quality of that kind of trust, the kind that comes from watching and waiting, from deciding that someone's willingness to remain on burned land in the morning constitutes a character reference. "There are more of us," Gerald said quietly. "Not everyone took the money. Some of us just didn't know what to do with what we had." He nodded at the binder. "Now maybe we do." At 4:30 that afternoon, Caleb was standing in his yard with Pete Calloway and Gerald Pruitt when Pete's son Danny, who had been clearing debris from the barn, stopped at what he was doing and looked up at the highway. "You expecting company?" Danny said. Caleb followed his gaze. 3 motorcycles had slowed at the end of his driveway. They were moving slowly the way motorcycles move when riders are looking carefully at something. Then they pulled in. Then about a quarter-mile behind them on the highway, Caleb could see more headlights in the late afternoon light moving in a line. Pete and Gerald both looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. The first 3 riders pulled into the yard and cut their engines. They were older men, Caleb's generation, and slightly younger, and they had the road-worn look of people who had been traveling for hours. The one who dismounted first was tall, gray-bearded, with a weathered face that carried its age the way weathered faces do when the years have been full rather than just long. He walked straight to Caleb. He stopped about 2 feet away and looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You look terrible." Caleb almost smiled. "You're late." 6 hours, Marcus Walker said. "I told you 6 hours." It's been 11, 7 of which you slept. He glanced at the ruined barn. Something moved across his face, not sentimentality exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of damage done to something that mattered to someone who mattered to you. Tell me about the man who pressed the gun. Later, Caleb said. First tell me how many. Marcus turned and looked at the highway. The headlights were closer now. The sound of engines had grown from a murmur to something that filled the air that you felt in your sternum as much as heard. Pete Calloway's son had stopped working entirely and was standing at the edge of the yard with his mouth slightly open. Enough, Marcus said again. You keep saying that. Because the number isn't what matters. He turned back to Caleb. What matters is who they are and what they brought with them. A pause. We've been making calls since midnight, Caleb, not just to riders, to people who know things, to people who owe things, to people who have been wanting a reason. He looked him square in the face. You're the reason. Gerald Pruitt was standing about 10 feet away, holding his canvas binder against his chest with both arms, watching the motorcycles fill the road outside. Marcus noticed him. Who's this? His name is Gerald Pruitt, Caleb said. He has documentation going back 2 years. Victor Halston destroyed his livestock operation. He's been waiting for someone to give the information to. Marcus looked at Gerald for a long moment. Then he walked over and extended his hand. Marcus Walker, he said, can I see what's in the binder? Gerald looked at Caleb. Caleb nodded. Gerald handed it over. Marcus opened it and stood in the yard reading it, turning pages slowly. While behind him, motorcycles continued arriving, and riders climbed off and stretched and spoke to each other quietly. Pete Calloway had gone to stand beside his son. Both of them were looking at the highway. Marcus reached the page about the D-out route change. He read it twice. Caleb watched his expression and saw the moment it changed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The moment when information shifts from concerning to serious. Is this sourced? Marcus asked Gerald. Yes, sir, Gerald said. Leanne, my daughter, she has the original documents, and a copy in a different location. Marcus closed the binder and looked at Caleb. This is bigger than a farm, he said quietly. I know, Caleb said. This man has been committing fraud at the state level. The road change alone, he stopped. Do you know anyone in the state AG's office? No, but I might know someone who does. Caleb thought for a moment. Leanne Pruitt is a paralegal in Great Falls. If she's been doing records requests, she knows the system. She knows who to call. Marcus turned and looked at one of the riders behind him. A heavy-set woman with silver hair and a posture that suggested she was accustomed to being in charge of things. Gina, he said, come here. The woman walked over. This is Gina Torres, Marcus said. She spent 15 years in civil litigation before she retired and moved to Wyoming. He looked at Gina. We need to talk to a paralegal in Great Falls named Leanne Pruitt. Her father has documentation of a state-level land fraud scheme tied to a highway expansion. The pattern goes back 8 years and involves at least 11 properties. Gina looked at the binder in Marcus's hand. Then she looked at Gerald. Your daughter, she said, she still have access to her firm's law library? Gerald blinked. Yes, I think so. She works. Call her, Gina said. Right now, we're going to need to move fast before Victor Halston finds out what's coming and starts destroying records. She looked at Marcus. Do we know if he has people watching this property? Silver sedan, Caleb said. Tinted windows. Came past twice this morning. Partial plate. He gave her the numbers he'd memorized. Gina pulled out her phone and walked away. 2 more motorcycles pulled into the yard. Pete Calloway came to stand beside Caleb. He said nothing for a moment. Just stood there looking at what was filling his neighbor's driveway. Then, Caleb, who are these people? Caleb watched Marcus Walker move through the arriving riders with the specific efficiency of a man who had been coordinating large groups of people in difficult circumstances for most of his adult life. He watched Gerald Pruitt follow Gina Torres toward the farmhouse, his binder clutched in both hands, already on his phone calling his daughter. He watched the riders who had arrived first stretch and talk and look at the burned barn with the same expression Pete had worn that morning. A kind of offended communal recognition of damage done to something that shouldn't have been touched. They're the answer to a question I asked 32 years ago, Caleb said. He looked at Pete. When I first left the road and came here, I asked myself what I was worth, not what I'd done, not what reputation I had, but what I was actually worth to the people who knew me. He paused. This is the answer. Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to call Linda and tell her we're going to be feeding a lot of people tonight. Caleb put his hand briefly on the man's shoulder. Thank you, Pete. Pete went to his truck. Caleb turned back to his farm, what was left of it, what was still standing, and what was beginning to gather in the yard, with the particular gravity of people who had shown up because they were asked to and intended to stay until it mattered. The sun was low now, angling across the burned east fields, and the smoke smell had mostly cleared, replaced by something else. He couldn't quite name, something that had more to do with movement than with stillness, more to do with motion than with ash. Victor Halston had sent men to Silver Creek to break something. He had not considered what it might look like when the pieces came back together. Linda Calloway arrived at 6 with 2 other women from the farms north of Silver Creek, and they brought enough food to feed an army, which turned out to be exactly what was needed. Nobody had asked them to come. Pete had called Linda. Linda had called her neighbor Donna. Donna had called her sister-in-law Ruth, and the 3 of them had simply shown up with everything their kitchens could produce on short notice, because that was what women in Silver Creek did when something bad happened to someone who deserved better. The riders ate. They were quieter than people expected. That was the thing most people got wrong about men like this. They imagined noise and aggression, some performance of toughness. But the reality was that men who had spent their lives in genuine physical danger had nothing to prove at a kitchen table. They said thank you. They asked for seconds politely. 3 of them helped carry dishes without being asked. Marcus sat at the far end of Caleb's kitchen table with Gina Torres and Gerald Pruitt's daughter Leanne, who had driven down from Great Falls and arrived just before dark, still in her work clothes with her father's second copy of the binder and 3 additional folders of records she'd pulled that afternoon. She was sharp mid-30s, Gerald's same careful quality, repackaged into someone who had learned to operate inside systems her father had never had access to. And within 10 minutes of sitting down, she and Gina were speaking the specific shorthand of people who understood procedural law in ways that most civilians don't. Caleb sat near the window and listened without participating, the way he had always listened when people around him were more equipped than he was for a specific task. This was one of the things that had made him effective in his old life, knowing when to lead and knowing when to stand back and let people who knew what they were doing do it. Outside, the riders had organized themselves without being told to. 3 of them had positioned near the road. 2 more had taken the east side of the property near the burned fields. It was not a military deployment, and nobody had called it one. But the effect was the same. Caleb's farm had a perimeter for the first time in 30 years, and the silver sedan that had passed twice that morning did not come back. At 9:15 that night, Gina Torres put down her pen and looked at Marcus. "We have enough," she said. Marcus looked at her. "For what?" "For a federal complaint. Not a county complaint, federal. The DOT route changed the documented pattern of intimidation, the arson, the assault on Caleb. When you layer all of it together under a RICO framework, which is what this is, Victor Halston has been running a criminal enterprise to fraudulently acquire land in conjunction with corrupt government officials." She paused. "The DOT thing alone is mail fraud. That goes federal immediately." The kitchen was very quiet. "How long does federal take?" Gerald asked. "Depends on the field office, depends on the agent." Gina looked at Leanne. "You said you know someone in the Billings FBI field office." "A paralegal there. We went to school together. I can make a call." Leanne hesitated. "Tonight." "Right now," Gina said. Leanne stood up and walked outside with her phone. Caleb watched Gerald watch his daughter through the window. The old man's face held something complicated, pride mixed with the particular anguish of a parent who never wanted their child to have to fight battles that started as the parent's own. Caleb recognized that expression. He had worn a version of it himself in a different context on a different night a long time ago. "She's good," Caleb said to Gerald. Gerald kept watching through the window. "She's better than me," he said. "Always was." At 10:30, Marcus pulled Caleb outside and they stood in the yard away from the others. "Gina thinks we can have federal eyes on this by tomorrow," Marcus said, his voice low. "But here's the problem. Victor Halston is going to find out you didn't run. Maybe he already knows. That silver sedan this morning, whoever was driving it reported back. He's going to be calculating his next move." "I know," Caleb said. "He's going to come at this with lawyers. That's his first response to everything. He's going to try to bury the complaint in procedural objections, get ahead of it in the media, characterize you as a disgruntled landowner with a grudge. and he's going to characterize us, Marcus stopped. As a gang, Caleb said. As a threat, as intimidation from the other direction. He'll try to flip the story. Marcus looked at him directly. We've seen it before. The moment powerful people feel exposed, they make themselves the victim. He'll say we show up to threaten him. He'll say you called in criminals to harass him out of a legitimate business negotiation. Caleb thought about that. Then we need to be careful about what this looks like. We're already being careful. Nobody is going near Victor's property. Nobody is making any contact with his people. We're here on your land as guests. But the optics, Marcus shook his head. 100 motorcycles showing up at a farm in rural Montana. The news is going to write the story before they know the facts. Then we give them better facts, Caleb said. Tomorrow morning I want to talk to the sheriff before anyone else does. Dan Brooks is a decent man. Pete said so, and Pete doesn't say things like that about people unless he means them. He paused. If I walk into that office with Gerald's binder and Leanne's records before Victor's lawyers make their move, before anyone can reframe this, then we control what Dan Brooks understands first. Marcus was quiet for a moment. And if Brooks is in Victor's pocket, then we find out right away, and we have already filed the federal complaint, and we know who we're dealing with. Caleb looked at him. Either way we find out, that's worth something. Marcus nodded slowly. All right, he paused. I'm coming with you. Marcus, not inside, outside. His voice was firm, but not aggressive. I'll wait on the street, but you're not going into that building alone the morning after someone burned your barn and put a gun to your chest. Caleb understood he was not going to win this particular disagreement. Fine. They went back inside. The kitchen was still busy. Gina on one phone, Leanne on another, Gerald rereading sections of his binder, with the focused attention of a man who had memorized every word but kept checking to make sure nothing had changed, and Caleb stood in the middle of it for a moment and felt the strange accumulated weight of a day that had started with him alone on a burned farm and arrived here at nearly 11 at night, with his kitchen full of people working toward the same thing from different directions. I thought about Rachel, not with grief this time, with something more like conversation, the way you talk to people who are gone when something happens that you know they would have had something to say about. Rachel had always been suspicious of the idea that things happened for reasons she was too practical for that kind of cosmology, but she would have had something to say about tonight, something that cut to the center of it in fewer words than anyone else would need. I thought she would have said, look what happens when you let people help. He went to bed at midnight and slept for 5 hours, which was more than he expected. Victor Halston arrived at Caleb's property at 8:15 the next morning, not with thugs this time, with lawyers. 2 of them in a black SUV with a second vehicle behind it that Caleb recognized as belonging to county administrative offices. There was a man in the second vehicle who Caleb did not know by face, but Gerald, standing at the edge of the porch, identified immediately. That's Dale Croft, Gerald said, his voice going flat. He's Victor's man at the county assessor's office. That's the man who, when I filed a complaint about my water tank, he's the one who handled the environmental report that found nothing. Caleb looked at Gerald. You're sure? I'm absolutely sure, Gerald said. I know that face. I spent 6 months looking at that face and wondering if he slept at night. Marcus appeared at Caleb's shoulder. He had been up before dawn and had a cup of coffee in his hand, in the calm, specific attentiveness of a man who had anticipated this development. Let me know what you need, he said quietly. Stay back, Caleb said. Both of you. He walked down the porch steps and into the yard. Victor Halston was not what people imagined when they thought of a villain. He was 61, moderately tall with gray hair, cut expensively, and a face that the word distinguished applied to in a way that made the word itself feel like a minor crime. He wore a jacket that cost more than Caleb's truck. He had the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades in rooms where everyone deferred to him, and he carried that ease into Caleb's yard the way people carry habits without thinking about it. Well, none of the lawyers stepped forward first, young suited already opening a briefcase. Mr. Dawson, my name is Philip Garrett. I know who you represent, Caleb said. He was looking at Victor. You can wait. Philip Garrett's mouth closed. Victor looked at Caleb with an expression that was carefully calibrated to suggest sympathy. It was a very good expression. Caleb had met enough men like Victor to know that the scariest thing about them was not the cruelty, it was the competence. The violence they directed was never random. It was administrative. It was a budget line item. Mr. Dawson, Victor said, I heard what happened to your property last night, and I want to say, don't, Caleb said. Victor paused. Don't tell me you heard about it like it was news that came to you. Caleb's voice was level, not loud, not aggressive, completely flat. You sent them. One of your men took a photograph of me on my knees in my own yard and sent it to you. You know exactly what happened because you ordered exactly what happened. He looked at Victor without looking away. So don't stand in my yard and perform surprise. Something shifted in Victor's face. The sympathy expression didn't disappear. He was too controlled for that, but it became less comfortable, like a mask that still fit but was being worn differently now. You're upset, Victor said. I'm clear, Caleb said. There's a difference. Philip Garrett stepped forward again. Mr. Dawson, regardless of the circumstances, we're here to present you with a formal offer of purchase for this property, which I think you'll find more than Philip. Victor said it quietly and the lawyer stopped again. Victor looked at Caleb for a moment and something recalculated behind his eyes. He was reading the yard, reading the people visible on and around the porch, reading the situation he'd walked into and making adjustments. That was what men like Victor did. They adjusted. You have company, he said. That's unexpected. Is it? Victor looked past Caleb at the porch. His eyes moved across Marcus, across Gerald, across Pete Calloway, who had arrived an hour earlier and was standing near the fence with his arms crossed across Danny, who had not stopped clearing debris and was doing so loudly enough that the sound of it filled the yard at intervals. Then Victor's eyes came back to Caleb, and for the first time since he'd stepped out of the SUV, Caleb saw something in his face that had not been there before. Not fear, not yet, but its precursor. The specific discomfort of a man who has walked into a room expecting to find it arranged one way and found it arranged differently. Mr. Dawson, Victor said carefully, whatever you think you know. I know about Dora Sattler, Caleb said. Victor went very still. 71 years old, her well was poisoned. The county environmental report found nothing. She took your settlement. He paused. I know about Gerald Pruitt's water tank. I know about Dale Whitmore's combine. I know about the 7 other properties between here and the highway corridor that you acquired over the last 8 years, using variations of the same approach. He looked at Victor. And I know about the DOT route change, 18 months ago. 6 weeks after you attended a fundraiser for the State Transportation Committee chairman. The yard was completely silent. Philip Garrett had stopped moving. He was looking at Caleb with an expression that had passed through professional composure and come out the other side, into something that looked a great deal like a man calculating how far his own legal exposure might extend. Dale Croft in the second vehicle had not gotten out of the car. Victor said nothing for almost 8 seconds, which is a very long time when nobody is saying anything. Then he said, you have no proof of any of that. Gerald Pruitt does, Caleb said. 2 years of records, original documents. The DOT route change sourced from public records requests, he paused. And last night, a former civil litigation attorney filed a formal complaint with the FBI's Billings field office. He watched Victor's face. Federal Mr. Halston, not county. Philip Garrett closed his briefcase. That was the tell. A lawyer closing his briefcase was a lawyer withdrawing from a negotiation, and Philip Garrett did it instinctively, the way animals move away from something before they fully understand why. Victor noticed in the noticing cost him something, a visible crack in the controls that he had been maintaining since he stepped out of the vehicle, just a hairline fracture, but enough. You've made a serious mistake, Victor said. His voice had changed. The calibrated sympathy was gone. What replaced it was not rage exactly. Rage would have been almost comforting. Rage was an emotion that made mistakes, but a cold, precise anger that was more like strategy than feeling. I have resources you cannot begin to. I know you do, Caleb said. I've been watching you use them for the last year. You have money and lawyers and relationships with people who make decisions in rooms that farmers like me never get invited into. He looked at Victor steadily. And I have something different. He didn't gesture at the riders, didn't look at Marcus, didn't make a production of it. I have people who know what you did and aren't afraid of you anymore. Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his SUV. Philip Garrett followed without speaking. Dale Croft in the second vehicle drove away before Victor's door was fully closed. The 2 vehicles left the driveway. The yard held its breath for a moment, then released it. Pete Calloway said, "Did that just happen?" It's not over, Marcus said from the porch. He was watching the road where the vehicles had disappeared. That's not a man who accepts the first loss. He's going back to make phone calls. He looked at Caleb. We need to move faster than he does. Caleb was already on his phone. I'm calling Dan Brooks. Sheriff Daniel Brooks was a 60-year-old man who had held his office for 12 years and had in that time developed a reputation that was about as rare as reputations of that specific kind tend to be in rural counties with significant property money moving through them. He was honest, not performatively honest, not honest in the ways that were convenient, but genuinely stubbornly. Sometimes inconveniently honest in the way that men become when they made a decision early in their careers that their character was not negotiable and have spent every subsequent year defending that decision. He arrived 40 minutes after Caleb's call alone in his department vehicle, and he got out and looked at the burned barn and said nothing for a moment, then looked at the people in the yard, and then he looked at Caleb. Walk me through it, he said. They walked. Caleb told him everything, the men, the baton, the gun to his chest, the photograph, the threat. Brooks listened without interrupting, making occasional notes in a small notebook, his face holding the controlled, attentive expression of a man receiving information he intended to use. When Caleb finished, Brooks looked at Gerald Pruitt. And you are? Gerald Pruitt, I lost my livestock operation 2 years ago. Halston's people destroyed my water supply, and I have documentation of... I know who you are, Brooks said. He said it quietly, and something in his voice made Gerald stop. I know because 18 months ago, one of my deputies took a copy of your initial complaint. And 6 weeks after that, I found that file moved to a closed case status with a note attached, saying the matter had been resolved through civil settlement. He paused. I never authorized that change. I never saw that note until after the fact, and by then, he stopped. By then, I didn't know enough to know what I was looking at. Gerald stared at him. You knew about my case. I knew there had been a case. I didn't know what happened to it. Brooks's voice was flat with the specific flatness of a man managing a significant internal response. I've had some questions about my department for a while now. I just didn't have the shape of the thing. He looked at Caleb. I think I might be starting to. Gina Torres stepped forward and introduced herself. She handed Brooks a copy of the same documentation that had gone to the FBI field office the night before. Brooks took it and stood reading it right there in the yard because he was the kind of man who read things when he received them rather than setting them aside. He turned pages slowly. He stopped at the D-out route change section and read it twice the same way Marcus had. He arrived at Gerald's property records and the license plates Gerald had written down and said without looking up, "This plate here, I know this vehicle. It's registered to a logistics company in Billings that I've been trying to connect to 3 separate incidents in this county for 2 years." He closed the folder. "Mr. Dawson," he said, "I owe you an apology." Caleb shook his head. "You didn't know. I should have known sooner." He said it without softening it, without deflecting. Just placed it there in the yard as an honest statement about the cost of things not caught in time. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to talk to the FBI field office in Billings," Gina said. "There's an agent named Reeves who received our complaint last night. We need the local sheriff actively cooperating and not," she paused inadvertently in Victor Halston's path. Brooks looked at her with an expression that was almost not quite, but almost a grim smile. "Lady, I've been inadvertently in that man's path for 2 years. I'm done with inadvertent." He pulled out his own phone. "Give me the agent's name again." He walked away from them, phone to his ear, and the call he made to the Billings field office lasted 22 minutes. They knew this because Marcus timed it. When Brooks came back, he looked different. Not lighter exactly, but more consolidated, like a man who had been carrying weight distributed incorrectly and had just found a better arrangement. "Agent Reeves is coming to Silver Creek tomorrow morning," Brooks said. "He's bringing someone from the U.S. Attorney's office." He looked at Gina. "You know what that means." "It means they already see what they need," Gina said. "Federal complaints don't get that response into 24 hours unless the field office was already building something." Everyone in the yard absorbed that. "They were already looking at Halston," Marcus said, not a question. "Apparently your complaint gave them what they needed to formalize it." Gina looked at Caleb. "You didn't just start something, you completed something that was already in motion." Caleb sat with that for a moment. He thought about Dora Sattler, 71 years old, her well poisoned, who had taken the settlement because she had nobody. He thought about what would have happened if she had been the last, if Victor Halston had worked his way down the corridor, and Caleb's farm had been just another quiet acquisition, another old person who disappeared into a settlement check and became a statistic. I thought about Gerald Pruitt's binder. 3 copies hidden in 3 different places, a man's 2 years of waiting compressed into a canvas folder. He thought about Rachel's fields on the east side, scorched at the edges, and felt the unfairness of it with a sharpness that hadn't dulled since the night had happened, and knew that it wouldn't dull, and had decided that was all right. Some things should stay sharp. They kept you honest. "What do we do now?" Pete Calloway asked. Before anyone could answer, Marcus's phone rang. He looked at the number. His face changed, a quick, specific change that Caleb recognized as the look of a man receiving information that accelerates an already fast situation. He answered, listened for about 45 seconds, said 2 words, "Got it," and hung up. He looked at Caleb. "Victor Halston just filed an emergency injunction in county court," he said. "He's claiming this gathering constitutes criminal intimidation and is requesting a court order to have us removed from the property." The yard went quiet in a different way than it had before. Not the quiet of relief or of things resolved, but the tight, pressurized quiet of people recognizing that the ground had just shifted. "He's fast," Gina said, and there was something in her voice that was almost admiring despite itself. "Can he get it?" Marcus asked her. "In this county, maybe. If he has a judge." She stopped. "Which judge?" Marcus looked at his phone. Filing went to Judge Carver. Gerald Pruitt made a sound. Everyone looked at him. His face had gone gray. Not sick gray, revelation gray. The gray of a man who has just connected something he should have connected earlier. "Judge Carver," he said slowly, "attended Victor Halston's last 3 fundraising dinners. I have the photographs. They're in the second folder, last section." He looked at Leanne. "Leanne, you have the second copy." "Already pulling it up," Leanne said, her phone out, fingers moving. "That won't be enough for recusal by itself," Gina said. "Attending fundraisers isn't—" "There's more," Gerald said. "I didn't include it in the main binder because I wasn't sure it was relevant. Victor Halston donated $60,000 to Judge Carver's last re-election campaign through 3 different PACs." Leanne tracked the contribution chains. Gina Torres stopped talking. She turned and looked at Gerald Pruitt with the specific expression of someone who has just substantially revised their assessment of another person's importance. "Gerald," she said carefully, "do you have that documented?" "Yes," Leanne said from where she was standing with her phone. "I have it. Campaign finance records are public. It took me about 4 hours to trace the PAC chain, but it's clean and sourced." Gina turned to Sheriff Brooks. "Judge Carver cannot hear this injunction. We need to file for emergency recusal before that order is processed." She looked at her own phone. "I need 20 minutes in a quiet room." Brooks pointed at Caleb's house. "Use the kitchen." Gina went inside. Leanne followed. 30 seconds later, they could hear Gina's voice through the kitchen window, precise and rapid, talking to someone who was apparently as awake and as alarmed as she was. Marcus stood beside Caleb. He said nothing for almost a minute. "Then you know what Victor Halston is doing right now." "Making phone calls," Caleb said. "Yes, but something different from this morning. This morning he was managing a situation he thought he controlled. Right now," Marcus paused, "right now he's a man who has realized that the ground is not where he thought it was. And that's a dangerous moment. People like him, they don't panic exactly. But they accelerate. They start doing things faster than they should because speed feels like control." Caleb understood. "And fast men make mistakes." "Fast men make mistakes," Marcus confirmed. The afternoon was burning through. It was past 3, the light coming in at the low angle that Silver Creek got in the fall, the kind that turned everything amber and slightly false looking. Like a photograph taken with the wrong filter, and in Caleb's kitchen, a retired litigator and a paralegal from Great Falls were working at speed on a motion that would remove a corrupted judge from a corrupt developer's emergency injunction. And in the county seat, Victor Halston was working his phones with everything he had, and in Washington, D.C., someone in the U.S. Attorney's Office was apparently reading a federal complaint about an 8-year scheme of land fraud and assault in a small Montana county, and none of these things were slowing down. In the yard, Pete Calloway brought out 2 thermoses of coffee from his truck and handed them around without ceremony, because that was the only thing he knew to do, and he understood that sometimes the only thing is enough. Gerald Pruitt sat on the Caleb's porch steps with his canvas binder in his lap and looked at the burned fields and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said to nobody in particular, "I just want it to mean something, all of it. The records, the years of carrying it around. He stopped. I need it to mean something." Caleb sat down beside him on the steps. "It means something," he said. Gerald looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because 2 years ago when you made that first copy of your records and hid it somewhere safe," Caleb said, "you didn't do that because you expected nothing to come of it. You did it because you believed somewhere that the right moment would arrive." He looked at the burned fields. The moment arrived. Gerald was quiet for a while. His hands moved over the surface of the binder, not reading it, just touching it. The gesture of a man reassuring himself that something is still there. "She would have liked you," he finally said. Caleb looked at him. "Who?" "My wife Meredith. She died 3 years ago. She's the one who told me to keep the records in the first place. She said that the truth is only powerful if someone can read it, and you can only read it if you wrote it down." He paused. "She was smarter than me about everything." Caleb thought of Rachel driving a stake into the ground and saying right here with the confidence of someone who had already decided. "Mine too," he said. They sat together on the porch steps in the amber afternoon light, two old farmers on a burned property with a binder of evidence, and a kitchen full of people fighting for them, and neither of them said anything else for a while because nothing else needed to be said. Inside, Gina Torres was on the phone when she went suddenly quiet, and then she said, "Are you certain?" in a voice they could all hear through the open window. And then after another pause, she said, "All right, that changes the timeline. Yes, I'll tell them." She came out of the kitchen. She looked at Marcus. "Agent Reeves isn't coming tomorrow morning," she said. Everyone tensed. "He's coming tonight," she said. "And he's bringing 4 agents and someone from the state AG's office." She paused. "They've been building a case against Halston for 14 months. They were waiting for a victim who wouldn't settle." The yard absorbed that. 14 months. The FBI had been watching Victor Halston for 14 months, and the piece they needed, the person who would not disappear into a settlement. Check, who would not be quiet, who would remain on their burned land in the morning and make a phone call and let what was set in motion keep moving. That piece had been Caleb Dawson. Marcus looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. Because what was there to say really about standing on the right piece of ground at the right moment and refusing to move? Not because you were brave, not because you were strong, but simply because the land was Rachel's, and she had asked you to protect it, and you had said you would, and 32 years had not changed what that meant. Some promises don't expire. Caleb had known that since the night he dialed a number he hadn't used in 3 decades, and a man answered on the first ring who said, without hesitation, "Where are you?" The agents arrived at 11:40 that night. And the first thing Agent Reeves said when he shook Caleb's hand in the yard of the burned farm was, "Mr. Dawson, I've been hoping to meet someone exactly like you for about 14 months." Agent Reeves was not what Caleb expected. I was 44, compact with a face that managed to look simultaneously tired and completely alert, in the way that people look when they have been running on urgency for a long time. He wore a jacket over a collared shirt, no tie, and he shook Caleb's hand with both of his, in the way that some people do when they mean a handshake to communicate more than a greeting. He looked at Caleb's shoulder, the way it sat slightly wrong, the way Caleb unconsciously favored it, and said, "Have you had that looked at?" "No." "You should." He didn't press it. He moved on. "I know it's late. I know you've had a long 2 days. I'm going to try to be efficient." He looked around the yard at the riders still positioned at the edges of the property, at Marcus, standing near the porch, at Gina Torres, who had come out to meet him with a folder already in her hand. "Mrs. Torres, I've been told you filed the complaint last night." "That's right. I read it at 6 this morning." He took the folder she offered without opening it. "I want to tell you something, and I want everyone here to understand it, so please pass it along." He raised his voice slightly without making it theatrical. "Victor Halston has had a team of lawyers working to contain our investigation for the last 11 months. He knew we were looking at him. He didn't know what we had, but he knew we were looking. That's why he accelerated the land acquisitions. I was trying to get everything locked into completed transactions before we could move." He paused. What he didn't anticipate was a landowner who wouldn't sell. And what Mr. Dawson did by staying on this property, by making this visible, by connecting people who had been isolated from each other, is something our investigation could not have manufactured. Marcus said from the porch, You're saying you needed him. I'm saying the case needed what he did. Yes. Reeves looked at Caleb directly. Mr. Dawson, I need to ask you some questions tonight. I need a full statement about everything that happened 2 nights ago. The men, the assault, the arson, everything you can remember. After that, I need you to be available for the next several days because things are going to move fast. Can you do that? Yes, Caleb said. Good. He finally looked at the burned barn, just a brief glance the way investigators look at evidence when they are trying not to look at it emotionally. One more thing. The injunction Victor filed this afternoon was denied. Judge Carver recused himself about an hour ago. Gina Torres made a small, controlled sound that in another context might have been a laugh. How long did it take after you received our recusal motion? About 20 minutes, Reeves said, which tells you something about how thoroughly Judge Carver understood his own situation. He opened the folder she'd given him and looked at the first page. The campaign finance documentation is clean. This is good work. That was Leanne Pruitt, Gina said. I'd like to speak with her tonight as well if she's willing. Gerald Pruitt, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the porch, stepped forward. That's my daughter. She's inside. He paused and something in his voice required effort to keep level. Agent Reeves, I filed a complaint with the County Sheriff's Department 2 years ago about what Victor Halston did to my property. A deputy took my documentation and nothing happened. I later found out the file was closed without my knowledge. He looked at Reeves steadily. Is there going to be an accounting for that? Reeves met his eyes without flinching. The deputy who closed that file without authorization is currently under separate review. That review began 6 weeks ago. He paused. I can't give you details, but I can tell you that your complaint is part of what triggered it. Gerald stood very still for a moment. 2 years of waiting compressed into about 6 seconds of stillness, and then he said, all right, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, and stepped back. They went inside. What followed was 4 hours of the most structured conversation Caleb had participated in since a time he preferred not to think about, specifically when he had been on the other side of this kind of table, and the questions had been about different kinds of events. He gave his statement twice, once informally working through the timeline with Reeves and a younger agent named Castallo, and once formally on the record. He was precise. He gave names where he had names, descriptions where he didn't, estimated times with the caveat that they were estimates, identified the baton strike without dramatizing it, and the gun without minimizing it. Reeves listened the way good investigators listen, not searching for the parts that fit what they already believed, but listening for the shape of the whole thing, the internal consistency, the places where a rehearsed story would have had 2 smooth transitions and an honest one had rough edges, because that was how memory actually worked. At one point, Reeves asked, the man who pressed the gun, the quiet one, would you recognize him? Yes. You're certain? Caleb looked at him. I spent 30 seconds looking at his face from about 8 inches away while he held a weapon against my chest. Yes, I'm certain. Reeves nodded and made a note. They finished at 3 in the morning. Most of the riders had settled in for the night, some in sleeping bags on the porch and in the yard, some in their vehicles, a few that Pete Calloway had taken back to his barn, which was large and dry, and Pete had offered without being asked. Gina Torres was asleep on Caleb's couch with her shoes still on and a legal pad on her chest. Gerald had driven home with Leanne an hour earlier, both of them having given extensive statements, both of them looking like people who had set down something heavy that they'd been carrying for a long time without realizing how much it weighed. Caleb stood on his porch alone after the agents finished and the house went quiet. The night was cold and clear and very still. He could see the outline of the burned barn against the sky, a silhouette that was wrong in the way of something subtracted, something that should have been there and wasn't. He had been looking at that silhouette for 2 days, and it still landed wrong each time, the way a missing tooth feels to your tongue long after it's gone. I thought about Victor Halston right now, somewhere in town or on the road, working his phones in the particular frenzy of a man who had believed himself untouchable and was beginning to understand that the architecture of his protection had more gaps in it than he'd known. He thought about the 11 lawyers Victor probably had on retainer and what they were being asked to do tonight, and whether any of them were smart enough to be telling their client something he didn't want to hear. I thought about the quiet man who had pressed the gun to his chest. He thought about how the man had said old men who refuse to move usually lose everything, and had believed it completely, and had been right about almost everything except the thing that mattered most. Not about the losing, but about the alone. Marcus came out of the house behind him, and they stood together on the porch in the dark. "When did you last sleep?" Marcus asked. "Last night, 5 hours. That's not enough for a man your age. You're 3 years younger than me." "4," Marcus said, "and I slept in the truck on the way here." He looked out at the yard. "Reeves is good. I've dealt with federal investigators before. Some of them come in with the case already written in their heads, and they're just looking for evidence to confirm it." Reeves was actually listening. "I noticed," Caleb said. "He's going to move fast. He said that things would move fast, and I believe him. When a 14-month investigation gets the missing piece, the people running it don't sit on it." Marcus paused. "Victor Halston might be arrested within 48 hours. Caleb said nothing. "How do you feel about that?" Marcus asked. It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one, and Caleb gave it the attention it deserved. He stood there for a while and actually examined what was happening inside him, which was more complicated than he would have expected. There was a satisfaction, not triumph, which was a different thing, but the quieter sense of something being put right, of a weight that had been pressing down on too many people for too long, about to be lifted. There was grief still, about the barn and Rachel's fields, and the tin of hard candy, and the workshop. Grief didn't have a timetable. He knew that. And there was something else, something he was having trouble naming. "I keep thinking about Dora Sattler," he said. Marcus waited. 71 years old, alone, her well poisoned. She took the settlement because she had no one. He looked at the dark outline of the burned barn. Whatever happens to Victor Halston, the arrest, the trial, the consequences, it doesn't give her those years back. The time she spent afraid, the time she spent dealing with what they did to her property, the decision she had to make knowing no one was going to stand up with her. He paused. "Justice after the fact is still justice. I believe that, but it doesn't cancel out what it cost people to get here." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "it doesn't. I want that on the record somehow. The people who had to settle, the people who gave up because they had no other option. I don't want this to be a story about Caleb Dawson getting satisfaction. I want it to be a story about 11 farms." He turned to look at Marcus. "Can Gina help with that civil cases for the people who settled?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I'll ask her in the morning." They stood in the quiet for a while longer. Then Marcus said, "You know what I remembered on the drive here? Something you said to me a long time ago, the night I showed up at the chapter house in Missoula with that phone number." He smiled slightly. "You told me I didn't owe you anything. You said just go home. Like what you'd done was nothing. Like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, stepping in between a scared kid and two men who intended to hurt him." Caleb remembered the parking lot, the smell of it, the particular quality of the light from the bar sign. Marcus's face, which had been so young. "You were terrified," he said. "I was absolutely terrified," Marcus agreed. "And you were so calm, not cold, just settled, like you had made a decision and the decision was made and there was nothing complicated about it." He looked at Caleb. "I've thought about that a lot over the years, how someone gets to that place, where doing the right thing doesn't require a speech or a calculation. It just happens." Caleb thought about it. "Rachel," he said. Marcus looked at him. "She changed how I thought about it. When I was young, doing the right thing was partly about me, about what kind of man I was. She removed that from the equation. She made it about the other person. Full stop." He looked at the farmhouse. "She was better at being a person than I was. I just tried to learn from her." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She sounds like someone worth 30 years of protecting a farm for." Caleb looked at the house. "Yeah," he said, "she was." Victor Halston was arrested at 7:14 the following morning. Caleb heard about it from Agent Reeves, who called at 7:40 and delivered the information in the same measured, efficient voice he used for everything, which Caleb was beginning to understand was not coldness, but professional discipline. He was taken into custody at his residence in Billings. His lawyers are already moving to secure bail, which they'll get, but there will be conditions on it, including no contact with any of the landowners involved in the federal complaint. A pause. We also executed search warrants this morning on his corporate offices and on Dale Croft's office at the county assessor's office. Sure. Dale Croft was arrested, Caleb said. Not yet, but we executed warrants on his office. That's a process conversation I can't say more right now. What I can tell you is that the warrants were granted based in part on Gerald Pruitt's documentation and the campaign finance records from Leanne Pruitt. A brief pause. Mr. Dawson, what you and these people did in the last 48 hours, the speed with which you assembled verifiable documentation, the decision to contact federal authorities, the coordination with local law enforcement. I've been doing this for 19 years. That was not ordinary. I want you to know that. Caleb sat with the phone against his ear and said nothing for a moment. Thank you, he said, and meant it. Not for the compliment. Compliments had never meant much to him, but for the underlying communication, which was that it had been worth something. That the 2 days of burned fields and late nights in a retired litigator on his couch and Gerald Pruitt's binder and Leanne's campaign finance traces had actually moved something in the real world, had actually disrupted something that had been operating with impunity for 8 years. That it had meant something. He hung up and went out to the porch. Marcus was already there, coffee in hand, talking to two of the riders in low tones. He looked at Caleb's face and said, "It happened. 7:14 this morning." Marcus turned to the two riders and said something Caleb didn't catch. Then he looked back at Caleb, and there was a moment between them, brief with no ceremony to it, that was about something that didn't require words. 32 years of distance collapsed into about 5 seconds of eye contact, and then Marcus raised his coffee cup slightly, and Caleb nodded, and that was the whole of the celebration. Pete Calloway arrived at 9 with Danny and Linda had brought breakfast food enough for 30 people because she had apparently decided that a federal arrest was the kind of thing that required eggs and biscuits and an unreasonable amount of coffee. She set it all up on Caleb's kitchen table without being asked to, moving around his kitchen with the comfortable authority of a woman who had been feeding people through difficult events for 40 years and knew exactly what she was doing. People ate slowly in shifts in a kitchen that felt different this morning than it had the last 2 days. Not lighter exactly. The barn was still burned. The fields were still damaged. Dora Sattler had still spent 2 years alone with her poisoned well. But the air had a different quality to it, the quality of a held breath finally released. Gina Torres came in at 9:30, shoes on this time, legal pad in hand, and found Caleb at the table. "I want to talk about the civil cases," she said, setting her pad down. "I was going to bring that up this morning," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Marcus told me last night. I made some calls at 6 this morning." She sat across from him. 3 of the settled landowners, including Dora Sattler, may have grounds for fraud-based nullification of their settlement agreements. If the criminal case establishes that those settlements were obtained through coercion and illegal activity. That's not simple and it's not fast, but it's possible. She paused. The other issue is restitution. If Victor is convicted on the federal charges, the court can order restitution to victims, including people who settled. It won't replace everything, but it's not nothing. Caleb looked at her for a moment. "Dora Sattler, can someone reach her?" "I'm working on it." Gina held his gaze. "Caleb, I need to tell you something. I retired from civil litigation 7 years ago because I was exhausted. I was tired of the pace and the politics and the way the system grinds people down who can't afford to grind back." She paused. "This is the first morning in 7 years I woke up feeling like I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. I just wanted to say that." Caleb looked at her. She was not a sentimental woman. He had understood this within approximately 20 minutes of meeting her, which meant that what she just said cost her something, and she had said it anyway. "Thank you, Gina," he said. "Don't make a thing of it," she said, and looked back down at her legal pad. At 11 that morning, the news van arrived. Caleb had been expecting it and had already decided what he was going to do about it, which was precisely what Marcus had warned him about and precisely what Caleb had decided he needed to do anyway. He walked to the end of his driveway while Marcus stayed back near the porch in a position that meant he was close enough to be present but far enough to be peripheral, which was exactly what Caleb had asked him to do. The reporter was young, late 20s, a woman with a calm, direct manner that Caleb found he appreciated, and she asked him very simply what had happened. He told her, clearly without embellishment, without anger, in the straightforward way he had given his statement to Agent Reeves. He told her about the night of the fire, He told her about Victor Halston. He told her about Gerald Pruitt and about what Gerald had spent 2 years doing alone because he didn't know where else to put it. He mentioned Dora Sattler by name and said clearly that he wanted people to know her name. You didn't settle, the reporter said. Why not? Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked back at his farm, at what was burned and what was still standing, at the riders still present in the yard, at Pete Calloway's truck parked at the fence, and Linda moving around inside the kitchen, visible through the window. At the remains of the workshop in the East Field and the barn where he'd kept Rachel's things. Because my wife asked me to protect this place, he said, and that was the last thing she asked me. The reporter was quiet for a moment. What happens now? Now the system does what it's supposed to do, Caleb said. That's all I ever wanted. Not revenge, not satisfaction. Just the system doing what it's supposed to do for everybody, not just for people who can afford to make it. The interview was done in 12 minutes. What Caleb did not know what he found out. Later that afternoon from Leanne Pruitt, who was monitoring the situation, was that during those 12 minutes while he was standing at the end of his driveway talking to a reporter, Philip Garrett, Victor's lead attorney, was in a conference call with two senior partners from his firm and Victor Halston's corporate restructuring lawyer, and the substance of the conversation, which Leanne learned about through a source she declined to name, which Caleb respected, was that Philip Garrett was considering withdrawing from Victor's representation. Not because of the evidence, not because of the federal complaint, because of the riders. Because of what it meant in practical terms that a man like Caleb Dawson had made a phone call, and within 6 hours the road outside Silver Creek had filled with people who drove through the night from 3 states because they had been asked to. Because whatever story Philip Garrett had been told about Caleb Dawson, a stubborn old farmer, an isolated holdout, a man whose refusal to sell was an inconvenience to be managed, had turned out to be a story about the wrong person. Garrett withdrew from the case 2 days later, citing a conflict of interest that prevents my continued representation. He didn't elaborate. Nobody pressed him. The afternoon was quieter than the morning. Some of the riders left, not all of them, but those with obligations they had been holding at bay for 2 days. They left in the same way they'd arrived, without announcement, without formality, with nods and brief words, and in a few cases handshakes with Caleb. They were the same kind of handshake Reeves had given him, the kind that carried more than a greeting. One of them, a man in his 60s, gray-haired, who had not spoken to Caleb at all during the 2 days he was there, stopped on his way to his motorcycle and looked at the burned barn for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb and said, I didn't know him 30 years ago, but Marcus told me about you. He paused. I came because the right people come when the right person calls. He got on his motorcycle and left without waiting for a response. Caleb stood there for a moment. He went back inside. At 4 p.m, Gerald Pruitt called. Leanne just told me about the restitution possibility, he said. His voice had a quality to it that Caleb hadn't heard before. Not happy exactly, not relieved exactly, but the specific texture of someone who has been in a closed room for a long time and has just felt air coming in under the door. She explained what Gina said this morning, the fraud nullification. I know, Caleb said. Gina is working on it. A pause. Caleb, I want to ask you something and I want you to be honest with me. All right. Do you think this actually works out? I've been in the system. I filed a complaint. I was ignored. I watched a judge who was bought get put on an injunction that Victor filed against us. His voice was steady, but the effort in it was audible. I want to believe it, but I've been believing it for 2 years, and most of that time, I was just a man hiding copies of a binder in different locations, hoping someone would eventually care. Caleb sat down at the kitchen table. I thought about how to answer that, not the easy answer, not the reassuring platitude that everything would be fine, because he didn't know that everything would be fine, and Gerald deserved better than a comfort that might not hold. He thought about what he actually believed. I think Victor Halston is going to face the consequences of what he did, he said. I don't know exactly what form that takes or how long it takes or whether it's everything it should be. The system is imperfect. We both know that. He paused. But 14 months ago, the FBI started watching him. 2 years ago, you started keeping records. 1 night ago, a federal agent shook my hand in my yard and told me that what we did in 48 hours was not ordinary. He looked at the wooden box still on the table, opened the photograph still visible. Something moved, Gerald. Something that was stuck for a long time moved. I believe that. A silence. Okay, Gerald said. Okay, that's enough for me, Gerald said. For today. He paused. I'll talk to you tomorrow." He hung up. Caleb sat at the kitchen table and looked at the photograph. The younger version of himself grinning in the sunlight, the vest, the men on either side. He thought about what Marcus had said the previous night, how settling, how calm the decision-making process was, how he didn't seem to need a speech about it. The truth, which he had never told anyone and which he turned over carefully now in the quiet kitchen, was that it hadn't always been that way. The calm he carried now was the product of something of Rachel, yes, and of 30 years on this farm, and of what farming did to a person's understanding of time and patience, and the relationship between work and outcome. But before Rachel, before Silver Creek, before the farm, he had not always been settled. I had been in certain very specific moments of his younger life afraid. Not of people or physical danger, those things had never frightened him much, which was its own kind of problem. But afraid of what he was capable of the line between planting himself between someone frightened and something dangerous, and crossing into something else, something less defensible. That line was always there. He had known men who couldn't see it. Rachel had helped him see it. By showing him what was worth protecting, she had shown him why the line mattered. There was no abstract moral code involved. It was completely practical. You protect what matters by not becoming the thing that threatens it. He closed the wooden box. He heard Marcus's boots on the porch steps, and the kitchen door opened, and Marcus came in and sat down across from him without ceremony and looked at the closed box for a moment. "I have to leave the day after tomorrow," Marcus said. "Most of the others will leave tomorrow. Gina is staying a few extra days. She wants to be here when the restitution conversation formally starts." He paused. "I need to ask you something before I go." "Go ahead." "Are you all right?" He asked it the way a man asks when he wants to know the real answer. Caleb thought about it. "I'm not all right in the sense that my barn is ash and Rachel's fields are scorched, and I'm 67 years old with a cracked shoulder, and I watch men I'll never fully forgive take a photograph of me on my knees in my own yard." He paused. "But I'm all right in the sense that I know what I'm doing here and why I'm here and what this land means. And I know that what happened in the last 2 days meant something to people who needed it to mean something." He looked at Marcus. "That's a kind of all right." Marcus nodded. "That's the real kind," he said. Outside, Pete Calloway and his son Danny had resumed clearing the debris from the barn. Caleb could hear them working, the sound of it, the rhythm of it. Two men doing physical labor with the particular focus of people who understood that the most concrete thing you could do for someone in pain was clear the wreckage and make space for what came next. He went outside to help them. He worked for 2 hours, moving burned timber and sorting what was salvageable from what wasn't, and his shoulder hurt the whole time, and he didn't stop. And at one point, Pete Calloway looked at him and said, "You don't have to do this today." And Caleb said, "I know," and kept working because Rachel's farm was his to take care of, and he intended to take care of it, and no burned barn, and no cracked shoulder, and no Victor Halston was ever going to change that. The evening came in cool and quiet. The riders who were still there gathered around Pete's truck at the edge of the property, and someone had brought a guitar and was playing something low and unhurried, and Linda brought out more food because Linda apparently had decided that food was the answer to everything and was not wrong. Caleb ate his dinner standing on the porch because it was his porch and his property, and the view from it, even with the burned barn in the silhouette, was still his and still worth standing to look at. He thought about what came next: the trial, the restitution process, the reconstruction of the barn, the replanting of the East Fields, all the long, slow, unglamorous work of putting something back together that someone else had broken. He was tired in a way that went to the bone. But underneath the tired, steady, and unmistakable was something else. The thing Rachel had always said she loved most about him, not the strength, not the history, not any of the things other people cited. She said she loved the way he stayed. The way when he was somewhere that mattered, he simply stayed. He stayed, that was all. And it had turned out to be enough. The new barn went up in November. Not all at once, nothing real happens all at once, but piece by piece across 3 weekends when the weather held, and Pete Calloway organized the labor, the way he organized everything, which was quietly and without asking permission, and with the assumption that people who needed to show up would show up. They did. 14 men from the surrounding farms came the first weekend, some of whom Caleb had known for 30 years, and some he had only met through the events of October. And they worked from first light until they lost the light, And Linda and Donna and Ruth ran food out to the site all day because that was what they did and nobody questioned it. Caleb worked beside them every day. His shoulder had been examined. Finally, Gina Torres, on her third day staying at his farm, had simply announced that she was driving him to the clinic in Garrison, whether he agreed or not, and had done so with the same precision she applied to legal documents. The verdict was a hairline fracture of the clavicle, which the doctor described as something that would heal on its own, given rest, and which Caleb described to Pete as manageable, and which Pete described to Linda as the old fool is going to work on that barn, whether it's healed or not, so let's just make sure someone keeps an eye on him. They were all correct. He worked carefully. He didn't lift what he shouldn't lift. He accepted help when it was offered, which was its own kind of progress. The trial date for Victor Halston was set for the following spring in federal court in Billings. The charges were substantial racketeering fraud conspiracy to commit arson, aggravated assault by proxy bribery of a public official, and 5 counts related to the DOT route manipulation scheme. Dale Croft had been arrested 6 days after the search warrants were executed, and in the particular way of men who built their lives as accessories to other people's power, he had immediately begun cooperating with federal prosecutors in exchange for considerations that Leanne Pruitt described in the careful language of someone who understood legal process as significant. Philip Garrett, who had withdrawn from Victor's representation, could not be compelled to testify about privileged communications, but could be and was asked about the timeline of events around the injunction filing and what he said in those conversations. Again, through Leanne, who had more sources than she ever fully explained, suggested a man carefully constructing distance between himself and his former client. Judge Carver resigned his seat in December, citing health reasons. Nobody in Silver Creek County believed the health reasons. Nobody said so publicly except Pete Calloway, who said so to Caleb over coffee one morning with the specific satisfaction of a man who has watched an overdue accounting finally arrive. The deputy who had closed Gerald Pruitt's complaint without authorization was terminated from the sheriff's department in November, and Sheriff Brooks made a public statement about it that was notable for containing no euphemism whatsoever. He said a member of his department had violated the trust of a citizen who came to them for help, and that the department's failure to catch it sooner was his responsibility, and he intended to carry it as such. He said it plainly at a press conference, in front of a local reporter and a camera. And when the reporter asked if he expected the terminated deputy to face criminal charges, Brooks said he expected the appropriate authorities to make that determination and that he had provided full cooperation with that process. Caleb watched the press conference on Pete's laptop because he still did not own one of his own, and he thought about a man who had spent 12 years building a reputation for honesty and had found in October that the reputation was real and that it cost him something and had paid that cost without argument. There were people like that, he knew. They weren't common, but they existed. He had spent 30 years looking for them in Silver Creek without knowing that was what he was doing, and Dan Brooks was one of them, and Pete Calloway was one of them, and Gerald Pruitt was one of them in his quiet binder-keeping, copy-hiding way, and Rachel had been one of them before anyone else in his life. The new barn's frame was complete by the end of the second weekend, and standing inside it on Sunday evening, with Pete and Danny, and several of the men who had given their weekends to the work, Caleb looked at the structure around him, not finished, not yet, but shaped bones in the right places, the suggestion of what it would become, and felt something he had not expected to feel so soon. Something that wasn't grief. Not its absence. Grief was still there, would always be there, specific and precise, attached to things that no new barn could replace. But alongside it, occupying the same space without canceling, it was something that functioned like forward motion, like the particular stubbornness of living things that insist on continuing regardless of what has been done to them. He thought Rachel would have had a word for it. She always had words for things he couldn't name. I thought she would have called it obstinate hope. She used that phrase, sometimes usually about seeds. She said seeds were the most obstinate, hopeful things in the world because they had no reason to grow and grew anyway every spring, even after hard winters, even in damaged ground. He looked at the frame of the new barn. Obstinate hope, he thought. Yeah, that was about right. The federal trial was still 5 months away when the first letter arrived from Doris Sattler. Gina Torres had found her. This had involved a degree of detective work that Gina undertook with the same focused efficiency she applied to legal motions, which was to say she did not stop until she had what she needed. Dora Sattler was 73, now living in assisted living in Hover, which was where she had moved after accepting Victor Halston's settlement and leaving the farm her late husband had built. She had a daughter in Spokane and a son in Bozeman, and neither of them had been close enough in October to be part of what happened in Silver Creek. And so Dora had watched it, the arrest, the charges, the news coverage from the common room of a care facility in a city she had not chosen to live in, on a television that was always slightly too loud. Gina had called Dora's daughter first. The daughter called Euro, and Dora apparently had asked for Caleb Dawson's mailing address. The letter came in a plain envelope with handwriting that was slightly arthritic and entirely legible. It was 4 paragraphs long. He read it at the kitchen table with his coffee. She wrote that she had watched the news coverage of what happened at his farm in October and had not been able to stop thinking about it since. She wrote that she had made the decision to accept Halston's settlement in a single afternoon sitting in her kitchen with his lawyer's paperwork and no one to call, and that she had spent 2 years since then wondering whether she had failed something, whether she had failed her husband's memory, failed the farm, failed herself. She wrote that watching Caleb stay on his property the morning after the fire, watching what arrived because he stayed, had changed something for her that she was having trouble finding the right words for. She wrote in the final paragraph, "I don't know if this letter makes sense to you. I just needed to tell someone who would understand that I was not a weak woman. I was a woman who was alone. Those are different things. I'm glad someone finally made that difference visible." Caleb read the letter twice. Then he sat at the table for a long time and did not do anything at all, just sat the way he sometimes sat when something had moved something in him and he needed to let it settle before he could respond to it. He wrote back that afternoon, longhand 3 paragraphs on the plain paper he used for the rare occasions he wrote letters. He told her she was not weak. He told her that aloneness was something that had been deliberately constructed around her and around the others, that isolating people from each other was the first tool in Victor Halston's arsenal because connection was the only thing that could defeat him, and that she had been denied that tool on purpose. He told her that Gerald Pruitt had kept 2 years of records in secret for the same reason she'd taken that settlement in a single afternoon, because he too had been alone, just alone in a different way, and had been waiting for someone to stand up first the same way she had. He told her that Gina Torres was working on the restitution process and that her name was in it and that someone was fighting for her now and that he hoped she would allow that. He signed it, Caleb Dawson, Silver Creek, Montana, and added a line that he almost crossed out and then left. Some debts run in both directions. What you carried alone for 2 years made this case real. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He mailed it. Gina called him that evening. "I talked to Dora's daughter today," she said. "Dora wants to testify." Caleb sat up. At the trial, as a victim witness, the prosecution has already indicated they want victim impact testimony, and they want it from people who settled, not just people who didn't. Dora's case is particularly strong because her settlement was signed under documented duress, and the environmental report that provided cover for the well poisoning was written by Dale Croft. Gina paused. She's 73 years old, and she said she would drive from Hoover to Billings in February if that's what it took. "She doesn't have to drive," Caleb said. "Someone will take her." I told her that. A brief pause. Marcus already offered. Something moved in Caleb's chest. He sat with it for a moment. Marcus Walker, who had driven through the night from Wyoming with 2 days' notice and no explanation required, who had stood in Caleb's yard at midnight and read Gerald Pruitt's binder page by page in the dark, who had spent 3 days coordinating people and information and legal processes with the same instinctive authority he'd carried since Caleb first knew him. Marcus had already called Dora Sattler and offered to drive her to the trial. Some things didn't change. Some things just waited 30 years and showed you they were still true. "Tell her yes," Caleb said. The weeks before the trial were strange in the way that periods of waiting are strange, dense with small events, with phone calls and paperwork and conversations with Agent Reeves about what to expect on the stand, and yet carrying an underlying quality of suspension of time, moving differently than it usually did. Caleb noticed it and accepted it the way he accepted most things now, as information rather than as disruption. Gerald Pruitt came by twice a week. This had started as visits specifically about the case, comparing notes from conversations with Leanne about the prosecution's progress, and had gradually become something else without either of them naming it. They were two old men on adjacent catastrophes who had discovered they thought about things the same way, and that was more than enough reason to drink coffee and talk. Gerald told him about Meredith in these conversations, his late wife, the one who told him to write things down because the truth is only powerful if someone can read it. He told him about her the way Caleb talked about Rachel, not with performance or sentimentality, but with the direct accuracy of someone describing a person who was still real to them and always would be. She had kept an enormous vegetable garden. She had loved detective novels. She had been, Gerald said with a completely straight face, absolutely impossible to argue with, not because she raised her voice, but because she had a quality he had never seen in anyone else, of simply waiting for you to run out of wrong and then continuing. Caleb laughed at that, genuinely full-throated, in a way that surprised him by its ease. He had not laughed like that in a while. Rachel was like that too, he said. Different approach, but same destination. She'd just look at me with this expression. Not disappointed, just patient, like she was giving me the time I needed to catch up to what she already knew. He shook his head. She was almost always right. Meredith was always right, Gerald said. Not almost, always. I've gone back through 38 years of disagreements in my head, and I cannot find one she got wrong. That's either very impressive or a very edited memory. Probably some of both, Gerald said. They sat for a while without talking, in the comfortable silence of people who had passed the stage where silence required filling. Then Gerald said, I want to ask you something I've been wondering about. Go ahead. The night it happened, the fire, the men, when you sat in the yard and watched your barn burn, he held his coffee with both hands. What kept you here in the morning? When they were gone and it was just you and the damage, what was the thing that actually kept you here? Caleb thought about it honestly. Not the answer that sounded right, but the real one. I tried to imagine leaving, he said. I tried to picture myself packing things and driving away, and I couldn't make the picture hold together. It kept falling apart. He paused. Not because I was brave, because this is where Rachel is. Her grave is in the east field under the oak tree she planted the year we moved here. And I realized that morning if I left, I was leaving her. Not just her memory, her. He looked at his coffee cup. I couldn't do it. That was all. It wasn't courage. It was just I couldn't leave her. Gerald was very quiet for a moment. Meredith is buried on our property too, he said. When they took the farm, when I accepted the settlement and left, I had to arrange to have her burial site treated as a separate protected easement. It's in the settlement documentation. Victor's lawyers argued about it for 6 days. His voice was even and precise and cost him something. They argued about my wife's grave. Caleb looked at him. That's what made me start the binder, Gerald said. Not the cattle, not the water tank, the 6 days of arguing about Meredith's grave. He looked at the table. I thought if I'm the only one who knows what these people are, then I have to write it down, every single thing, so that someday someone will know. The kitchen was very quiet. Someone knows, Caleb said. Yes, Gerald said. They do now. The trial began on a Tuesday in late February. Caleb drove to Billings with Pete Calloway and Gerald Pruitt, and Marcus met them there with Dora Sattler, who was smaller than Caleb had imagined. From her letter, a compact gray-haired woman with an upright posture and very clear eyes, and when she shook Caleb's hand in the lobby of the federal courthouse, she held it for a moment and said, I know you from your letter. Thank you for the line about the debts. I meant it, he said. I know you did. She released his hand. That's why it helped. The courtroom was large and institutional and cold, in the way federal spaces are cold, and Caleb sat in the gallery with Pete and Gerald and watched the proceedings with the focused attention of someone who understood that what happened in this room over the next several weeks would determine what the previous 5 months of everyone's lives had actually meant. Victor Halston sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit that fit him exactly with 2 lawyers. Caleb didn't recognize the third legal team he had cycled through since Philip Garrett withdrew, and he looked, if Caleb was being precise about it, diminished. Not ruined, not broken. Men like Victor didn't break the way smaller structures broke, but there was something different in the quality of how he occupied space. He had been in Caleb's yard on the morning he arrived with his lawyers. A man who filled his space with surplus excess authority, performed ease, the practiced presence of someone who had never in his adult life stood somewhere and felt the room against him. Now the room was against him, and he knew it, and the knowledge of it had changed the calibration. He looked at Caleb once across the courtroom. Caleb held his gaze and didn't look away. Victor looked away first. Gina Torres, who had been admitted to the proceedings as a consulting attorney for the victim witnesses, sat beside Caleb and said nothing. She didn't need to. The prosecution's opening statement lasted 3 hours over 2 sessions, and it was thorough in a way that Caleb found almost geometrically satisfying, not because it was punishing, but because it was structured. It laid out 8 years of activity, 11 properties, 5 documented incidents of physical intimidation, 3 government officials with documented financial connections to Victor Halston and the DOT route change, which the prosecutor described with a precision that left no interpretive space. She was a tall woman in her 40s who spoke the way Gina Torres spoke, without decoration, without theater, with the particular authority of someone who had prepared more thoroughly than the other side had anticipated. She said toward the end of her opening, "This is not a case about a land dispute. It is a case about a man who decided that the law applied to other people, that the rights of elderly landowners were negotiable, that the function of government was to serve his business interests, and that anyone who refused to cooperate could be made to cooperate through fear, through destruction, through physical violence, and through the corruption of the officials who were supposed to protect them." She paused. "It is also a case about what happens when the people he targeted refuse to disappear." Caleb felt Gerald shift beside him. He didn't look over. He didn't need to. He knew what the shift meant. Dora Sattler testified on the 4th day of the trial. She walked to the stand with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had chosen every step, and she sat down and answered questions in a voice that was quiet and completely unwavering. And she told the court what had happened to her, what had happened to her cattle, what the environmental report had said and what it had not said, and what it had felt like to sit in her kitchen with a settlement agreement from Victor Halston's lawyers and no one to call. When the prosecutor asked her if she felt she had been coerced, Dora Sattler said, "I felt that I was alone and that being alone was not an accident. I felt that someone had very carefully made sure I was alone before they came with the paperwork." She paused. "That is not a free signature on a settlement agreement. That is a signature obtained through isolation, and isolation, when it is engineered, is a form of force." The courtroom was very still. Victor's defense attorney stood for cross-examination and asked Dora whether she had read the settlement before signing it. She said yes. He asked whether she had been given time to review it. She said yes. He asked whether anyone had physically prevented her from calling an attorney. She looked at him for a moment and said, "No one physically prevented me. They simply made sure there was no one for me to call." The defense attorney sat down. Gerald leaned toward Caleb and said almost inaudibly, "Meredith would have loved her." "Yes," Caleb said, "she would have." Gerald Pruitt testified the following week. He brought his binder to the stand not as evidence the relevant documentation had already been formally entered, but because the prosecutor had asked him to describe the process of creating it, and he wanted to be able to hold it while he did. He described 2 years of record keeping. He described hiding copies in 3 locations. He described the 6 days of negotiation over Meredith's grave. When he said that last part, something moved through the courtroom. Not noise, the opposite of noise. The particular quality of silence that happens when everyone in a room understands simultaneously that they have just heard something that cannot be made less than what it is. Victor Halston did not look at Gerald while Gerald testified. Caleb noticed that. He thought about what it meant, not the legal meaning but the human meaning, to be in a room with a man whose wife's grave you had argued over for 6 days and to be unable to look at him. He thought it meant that somewhere underneath the suits and the lawyers and the construction of impunity, Victor Halston knew, had always known, had made the decision to proceed anyway, which was its own form of knowledge, its own form of choice. That choice was now in a courtroom. Caleb testified on a Thursday 11 days into the trial. He was on the stand for 2.5 hours. He described everything with the same precision he had given to Agent Reeves on the first night: the men, the baton, the gun, the photograph, the threat. He described watching the barn burn. He described the morning after. He described the phone call he had made and what he had said and what Marcus Walker had answered. The prosecutor asked him at one point why he had not called the police that night. Caleb said, "I've learned in my life that there are situations where calling the right authority is the correct move, and situations where you first need to understand what authority is actually right." That first night, I didn't have enough information to know what I was dealing with. So I made a call to someone I trusted and waited for more information before involving law enforcement. He paused. When I had the information, I called Sheriff Brooks. I believed that was the right sequence. The prosecutor nodded and moved on. On cross-examination, Victor's attorney asked Caleb whether he had invited a large group of individuals with criminal histories to gather on his property as a form of intimidation. Caleb looked at the attorney with the flat, patient expression he had been wearing for 67 years. I called a man who saved my life once when I was young. He came because he said he would. The people who came with him came because they chose to, and what they did on my property was help a retired litigator file a federal complaint, provide information to the county sheriff, and clear debris from a burned barn. If that constitutes intimidation, I'm not sure I understand the word. There was a sound in the courtroom that was not quite a laugh. The attorney moved on. Victor Halston did not testify in his own defense. This surprised no one who had been watching closely and was consistent with what Leanne Pruitt had been hearing from her contacts, that his legal team had made the strategic calculation that putting Victor on the stand allowed the prosecution to cross-examine him on 14 months of documented behavior, and that the risk outweighed any possible benefit. The defense case was thin. It relied primarily on characterizing the physical incidents as the actions of contractors, operating without direct authorization, a plausible legal theory. Gina explained to Caleb quietly in the corridor one afternoon, but undermined substantially by the evidence connecting Victor to the men, through phones, through payments, through Dale Croft's cooperation, and through the testimony of two of the contractors themselves, who had accepted plea agreements and described receiving instructions in terms that did not suggest independent initiative. The quiet man, the one who had pressed the gun to Caleb's chest, was named in those testimonies. His name was Raymond Voix, and he was charged separately and had not taken a plea, and his trial was scheduled for fall. Caleb had been asked how he felt about that by the prosecutor's investigator in a routine follow-up. He said he felt that every person who made a decision to participate deserved an individual accounting. He said it without particular heat because heat wasn't required. It was simply true. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Caleb went back to Silver Creek for those 3 days. He worked on the farm, he checked the new barn's progress, the interior work was nearly done, the stalls rebuilt, the east wall finished. He walked the fields and looked at the replanted east section still dormant in the February cold, but structurally sound, ready for spring in the way that damaged ground recovers when it has been tended properly. He got the call on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty on all primary counts. 11 of 12 charges. The one acquittal was on a minor procedural count that Gina described as meaningless in the context of the convictions. Sentencing was scheduled for April. Caleb listened to this on the phone, standing in his yard with the east field behind him and the new barn to his left, and he said thank you to Leanne, who had called him, and he hung up, and he stood there for a while. Pete Calloway appeared at the fence line because Pete had apparently stationed himself within visible distance of Caleb's property for the duration of the deliberation without mentioning it. Caleb looked at him. Guilty, he said. Pete put his hands on the fence post and looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked up. Linda's going to want to cook something. Tell her yes, Caleb said. Marcus called 20 minutes later. He already knew Leanne had called him too, or Gina had, or the news had moved. The way news moved through the particular networks Marcus operated, in which were faster than formal channels. He said, "How are you?" Caleb said. "I'm standing in my yard." "Good, Marcus said. "That's exactly where you should be." A pause that was full rather than empty. "Thank you," Caleb said, "for everything, coming, staying, all of it." "Caleb!" Marcus's voice was something specific. Not soft exactly, but personal. The voice of a man speaking without any performance in it. "You saved my life when I was 21 years old, and you never once mentioned it again. Not once in 32 years. A pause. "That's not a debt. That's just who you are, and this is just who we are." Another pause. "We're even, by the way. Don't argue." Caleb smiled. He didn't argue. They talked for a few more minutes about practical things. Gina's civil restitution work, which was progressing, which would take time, but was real. Dora Sattler, who had returned to Havre after testifying, but was reportedly in contact with her son about possibly moving to Bozeman to be closer to family. Gerald Pruitt, who had told Leanne he was considering buying a small property in Silver Creek and starting over smaller than before, but starting. After Marcus hung up, Caleb walked to the east field. He walked to the oak tree in the corner of the field, the one Rachel had planted the year they moved here, before the barn was built, before the workshop, before the fences and the equipment, and the 30 years of daily work that accumulates into a life. The tree was old enough now that it had become substantial. It had survived the fire because it was far enough from the barn, and because oak trees are stubborn in the way that Rachel had always described seeds no reason to survive, and surviving anyway. He stood next to it for a while. I thought about what he would say to her if he could say anything. He went through several possibilities and rejected them as too large or too small. He thought about the morning after the fire, sitting on the burn ground, and the moment the locked door in his chest had made that small click and he had gone inside and opened the box. He thought about what she would have said about Gerald Pruitt hiding copies of his binder in 3 locations. I thought about Dora Sattler saying that isolation, when it is engineered, is a form of force, and how Rachel would have immediately agreed with that and immediately said she wished she'd worded it herself. He put his hand briefly on the bark of the tree. What came to him was not words. It was more like weather, a shift in what the air felt like, in the quality of the afternoon, the sense of something witnessed, the sense of someone paying attention. He stayed for a little while. Then he turned around and walked back toward the farmhouse, where Pete Calloway was already heading up the drive, and Linda was behind him with what looked like an unreasonable amount of food. And the new barn stood where the old one had been, different but solid, and the east field was dormant and patient and ready for spring, and the farm that Victor Halston had tried to reduce to ash and surrender was still there, still standing, still his. That April, Victor Halston received 17 years in federal prison. Dale Croft received 4 years and significant financial penalties. Raymond Voigt went to trial in the fall and was convicted of assault and arson and received 9 years. The Diot route returned to its original configuration, which meant the highway expansion went elsewhere, which meant 12 other farms that had been in potential jeopardy were no longer. Gina Torres filed civil restitution claims on behalf of 7 of the settled landowners, including Dora Sattler, and 3 of those cases, including Dora's, resulted in judgments that could not return what had been taken, but placed an honest value on the taking and required the taking to be paid for. The county appointed an independent oversight committee to review a decade of assessor's office records. Sheriff Dan Brooks was reappointed with unanimous county commission support, which was itself news, in a county where unanimous commission votes were nearly unheard of. Gerald Pruitt bought 12 acres in Silver Creek that spring, a small operation, and planted hay the first year while he figured out what came next. He told Caleb he wasn't sure what came next. Caleb told him figuring it out was half the point. And every year on the anniversary of the night they burned Caleb Dawson's farm, motorcycles appeared at the edge of the property without announcement. Not many, sometimes 4 or 5, sometimes more. They never came in with noise or ceremony. And they arrived in the early morning before the town was moving, and they sat at the end of the driveway for a while, engines off, and then they left. The way they came, quietly, without needing anything in return. Caleb always heard them. He never went out. Not because he was unaware, not because it didn't matter to him, but because some things are complete in themselves and don't require addition, and a man standing at a window in the early morning, looking at people who kept their word, was already everything the moment needed to be. In Silver Creek, people talked about what had happened the way people in small places talk about things that define an era. Not obsessively, not with mythology, but with the matter-of-fact respect you give to events that revealed something about where you lived and who lived there with you. They talked about Caleb Dawson the way they talked about the river and the weather and the quality of a good season as part of the permanent condition of the place. I was just an old farmer most days. He fixed his fences and planted Rachel's fields in Rachel's order, and kept the tin of hard candy restocked on the new shelf in the new barn for emergencies, the same as always. He drank coffee with Gerald twice a week and talked about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. He called Marcus on the first Sunday of every month, which had become a habit neither of them had agreed to and neither of them questioned. He did not wear the colors. He did not speak at events or accept awards, or give the kind of interview that turned a man into a symbol. He stayed on his farm, because a man's true legacy is not the fear he once inspired, or the legend that followed him down 30 years of highway. It is the specific daily unglamorous decision to remain on the ground he chose in the life he built for the person he loved. Caleb Dawson stayed. And everything that mattered, the loyalty, the justice, the barn rebuilt and the fields replanted, and the people who had been alone finding each other across 2 years of kept records, in one phone call, in one man who refused to leave everything that mattered, grew from that single unbreakable fact. He stayed. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough.